Naeem and I always, in all the Sabille meetings and other meetings we go to, sometimes we're roommates even, and we end up having a long, ongoing dialogue. We see each other more abroad than we see each other in Israel and Palestine. But it always, we're always really talking, and I think this is there's a background frustration in a sense about what do we really do. And it's very good to get all the analyses and all the encouragement, and it's important, that we really talk with each other and meet with each other and so on. But there's always the issue of, so what? What do we do? And I think that's a weakness. I think there's a lot of organizations that exist in the States, but also globally, that are working in tandem, but not enough in tandem, not enough together. And of course, one of the problems is that events on the ground happen so fast that you're just organizing about one thing, and all of a sudden it becomes irrelevant, and you're in a whole different situation. That, to some degree, I think, is happening with the wall. In other words, it's very important to organize against the wall. And of course, on February 23rd, the International Court of Justice in The Hague is going to hear the case of the wall and hopefully condemn it. So it's an issue, but at the same time, events are moving much faster than that. And the political context in Israel, of course, is that Sharon is in the twilight of his career. He's facing a certain financial scandal that may or may not affect him. Certainly, I don't think there's an immediate danger to his government, but I think it's clear that in the next half year, or whatever, probably his government will finish in one way or another, and there'll probably be new elections within a year, maybe even a little more. But what we have to understand is that Sharon has always had a very clear idea of where he's going with all of this. Sharon, especially because since 1977, certainly, when the first Begin government was elected, Sharon was made the head of the Ministerial Committee on Settlements. In other words, from the very beginning, he really supervised and organized the entire enterprise that I think is nearing its completion of creating facts on the ground. This has always been explicitly Sharon's policy in particular. And Sharon, he has, and in a way it served him. He has an image, even though at one time he was a dashing young general. His image over the years has been, he's fat, he's elderly these days, he's sort of these days he has kind of a grandfatherly image, which certainly helps. But he also has kind of the image of a bull in a china shop. This awkward guy, he has an awkward way of speaking, his mannerism is kind of awkward, and in some ways he's a little bit laughed off, or he has a little bit of a clown persona about him in Israel. And in a way, I think what a lot of us have missed in characterizing Sharon is that he's extremely clever. And he's not only clever, but he has the big vision, the big picture. It doesn't always work out. His scenario for the war in Lebanon was to actually push the Palestinians into Jordan and have the Palestinians take over Jordan. Then Jordan would become the Palestinian state, and that would relieve pressure on Israel. Then Israel wouldn't have, the Palestinians would have their state, and Israel could say, okay, now we're free to annex the West Bank. In other words, it didn't work out that way. The Palestinians kind of exited left instead of right. But, he's got these very big, grandiose, you might say, ideas. On the other hand, he has tremendous power. Sharon is also a military guy who approaches things. Sharon knows every rock on the ground. He knows exactly why every settlement is where it is and what its role is, and exactly where he's going and what he's doing. He's very hands-on. He's very much a man of the ground. He's also a farmer. So he walks, and he's very close. In other words, the whole settlement enterprise has a very tight coherency and a logic to it, and a controlling aspect that comes from the fact that it wasn't designed in some drawing room of the Ministry of Defense or the Ministry of Agriculture or something. It really came out of the ground. And he's a man of the ground in different ways. You know, just one story that you may or may not know, that before Bush was elected, he had only been abroad, I think, once. Maybe once or twice. I know he'd gone to China with his father once, I think, and he might have had a visit to Mexico. But basically, Bush hadn't really been abroad. And in 1998, you know, and AIPAC is always a couple steps ahead of us. You know, AIPAC and a group called Republican Jews of Texas, I think, which is an interesting, you know, already was identifying Bush as an up-and-coming political star. And it was arranged that Sharon, who wasn't in power in 1998, that Sharon would invite Bush to come to Israel. And Bush did. So it was one of his first trips abroad. He was Sharon's personal guest. Sharon took him to his farm, so you got the farm ranch bonding, the male bonding. Sharon is this older guy, a military man, you know, everything that Bush had kind of missed. And then Sharon took Bush in his private car for a tour of the West Bank. And they simply spent a couple days driving around, meeting settlers, going up on hilltops. Sharon is explaining to him what's happening, going here and going, you know, those kinds of spaces, of moments, I think have tremendous political significance. So that now, you know, and then Bush and Sharon all of a sudden come to power simultaneously, with already a history and so on. Sharon is the foreign leader that's visited the White House more than any other foreign leader, period. Sharon has been, I think, 8 times in the White House since Bush has been elected. So you've got that whole, that kind of a background. So we have to understand then the lay of the land. If we want to evaluate where we're going politically, where we are politically, what the options are for a just peace, and also where our strategies are going, what our priorities are, what are we advocating for, what's possible, what's impossible, and so on, what's irrelevant. The wall might be very dramatic, but in some ways, as I'll show you in a second, the wall isn't the most relevant part, the most relevant element of the occupation. So that what I'm really, I think my piece of this whole thing is to try to insert in our discussions really a concept of what's happening on the ground. Because, again, I think that Sharon has succeeded. I think we're at the end of the process. He has succeeded in establishing facts on the ground that are irreversible. And that's what he set out to do. He set out to do 2 things in 1977. One was to make Israel's presence in the occupied territories irreversible and permanent. And I say a presence because, you know, Israel doesn't accept the very idea that it has an occupation. Because, first of all, Israel defines an occupation as one sovereign country conquering the territory of another sovereign state. And since there was never a sovereign state over Palestine, Jordan and Egypt were themselves conquering countries. Before that, the British. Before that, the Ottoman Turks that don't exist. Therefore, there's no prior claimant to the land, and therefore, since there isn't a sovereign claimant, then there could be no occupation. That's an argument that no country in the world, including the United States, accepts. But it's enough of a kind of a legal loophole that it's allowed Israel all these years to successfully avoid, for example, the Fourth Geneva Convention being applied to the occupied territories. Israel, of course, also sees the entire country as one country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. And from an Israeli point of view, you can't occupy your own country. So that Israel rejects the idea that there is an occupation at all, and therefore its policy has been to create facts on the ground that on the one hand make its presence irreversible, that incorporate in a permanent way the West Bank into Israel proper, and at the same time, of course, foreclose the possibility of any viable Palestinian state. Now, having said that, I want to say that, maybe actually I'll back up for 1 second. Having said that, I don't know if you can see this in the back, but Israel needs a Palestinian state. You know, although Israel sees the entire country as one country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan, Israel needs a Palestinian state because there are almost 4 million Palestinians in the occupied territories that Israel can't digest. In other words, if Israel, that defines itself as the only democracy in the Middle East, were in fact to make the entire country one country and give the Palestinian citizenship, it would cease to be a Jewish country. In the entire country between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, the population today is about 50-50. So it wouldn't be a Jewish state, which is the whole antithesis of Zionism. It defeats the entire point of the state of Israel. If, on the other hand, Israel makes the country one country, but doesn't give the Palestinian citizenship in a permanent sense, that's outright apartheid. And even in Bush's world, it's not easy to sell apartheid these days. So what do? The essence of the dilemma that Israel is facing is, how do we keep control of the entire country while at the same time relieving ourselves of the Palestinian population? And the answer, from my point of view, is exactly the answer that South Africa came up with, and that is you establish a Bantustan. Something like this. You establish a small Palestinian mini-state that on the one hand gets rid of that population. They have their state, they have a flag, they're in the Olympics or whatever, but it leaves Israel in control. That's where Sharon and the Israeli governments are going, and it's not only Sharon. This is a conception that's shared by both Labor and Likud. Now, I think that again, this enterprise of creating irreversible facts on the ground has reached its conclusion. There's a couple little things to do, but essentially I think we're at the end of the process. And there are 5 elements in creating this Bantustan, in creating this situation that I think are already in place, that I just want to sort of review with you quickly, just so you get an idea of what the situation is like on the ground. First of all, the Bantustan that's emerging is defined by what we call areas A and B. I won't go into all this complex alphabet soup reality that we live in. As some of you know this, but in 1995, in one of the agreements in the Oslo process, the West Bank was divided into areas A, B, and C. And over the years, these have become permanent kinds of islands on the West Bank. Gaza has a similar situation. Gaza is even more complex. Gaza is divided into white, green, yellow, and blue areas. But at any